a good friend to the council, and our board member, Jennifer Smith, who will have the pleasure of introducing our tonight's speaker. Jennifer Smith is an independent international arbitrator with more than 30 years of experience. She prides herself on being well-versed in the business and cultural realities of cross-border disputes, having appeared as an advocate and sat on arbitration in a large number of jurisdictions across the United States, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Jennifer, welcome.
Thank you, Sanja. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening. Ray Takei is the Hasib Sabbagh Senior Fellow for Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. His areas of specialization are Iran, political reform in the Middle East, and Islamic movements and parties. Prior to joining the Council on Foreign Relations, Mr. Takei was a senior advisor on Iran at the State Department. He was previously a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He has authored several books. His most recent book is The Last Shah, America, Iran, and the Fall of the Pahlavi Dynasty. Other books include The Pragmatic Superpower, Winning the Cold War in the Middle East, Guardians of the Revolution, Iran and the World in the Age of the Ayatollahs, Hidden Iran, Paradox and Power in the Islamic Republic, and The Origins of the Eisenhower Doctrine, the US, Britain, and Nasser's Egypt, 1953 to 1957. He has written more than 250 articles and opinion pieces in many news outlets, including Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. He has testified more than 20 times before various congressional committees and has appeared on a number of different news outlets. He has a doctorate in modern history from Oxford University. He speaks Persian and has a working knowledge of Arabic. He is a true expert in his field, and we are fortunate to have him with us this evening as a guest of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and thank you very much, Ray, for joining us, especially as Sandia noted, you did this on relatively short notice, so I want to say thank you very much for doing that. And also just wanted to highlight again, we'll put the link in the comment section, and it's also on our website for Ray's latest book, The Last Shah, America, Iran, and the Fall of the Pahlavi Dynasty. I just got the book yesterday. I've read as much as I could, but excellent book, like most of Ray's academic work. And if you have any interest, like I know a lot of our members do, about Iran, especially Iran since the time of basically World War II through the fall of the Shah, it's an incredible book. Great insider's knowledge, great understanding of everything that's going on and all the different actors that take place. And I just wanted to let people know we will still cover the topic that we're going to cover roughly about regime change in the Middle East, but we'll just have a bit more of a focus on Iran since we have such a renowned Iranian expert with us today. So maybe, Ray, I suppose, a lot of Americans realize that before World War II, the United States, in terms of foreign action or adventurism, whichever way you'd like to call it, outside of the Americas, there was not an awful lot of American interaction or intervention until World War II. But after that, obviously, that accelerated a lot, and in particular in the Middle East, a crucial geopolitically, and also just as very location. And obviously, that the area has enormous resources of oil, Iran in particular. Just very briefly, when we kind of get to the first regime change that we think about, the United States has a role in, the degree of it we can talk about soon. But can you talk about how it was set the stage for the, I suppose, election of Prime Minister Mossadegh, and also the years that preceded it, in World War II, the very trying and difficult scenario for the Iranian nation to basically have three major world powers, the US, the Russians, and the British, all trying to pull it all their different ways and have their own influence. How is it we got to Mossadegh? And then I suppose if you can talk us through how it is, basically we went from basically the Shah to Mossadegh, and then basically back to the Shah.
During the years 1941 to 1953, those were paradoxical years in Iran. On the one hand, it was a time of extraordinary vibrant politics. It was a time when parliaments mattered, prime ministers matter. There was actually a vibrant press, which is kind of unusual in a country with such high illiteracy. It was a time of elite politics, or you can even call it elite pluralism, where the leading families and aristocratic class was essentially in charge. The Shah was a monarch who would share power with other leading contenders. And it was a time when Persian statesmen accomplished extraordinary things between 1941 and 1953. If you think about where Iran was in 1941, as you mentioned, it was occupied by three powers, initially two, Russia and Britain. The United States joins later. The first Pahlavi king was exiled by the Allies because of his pro-German sympathies. His son, who was elevated to the throne, was about 21, 22 years old. And at that time, it wasn't even clear if the Pahlavi dynasty would survive, because the British did not really trust the dynasty. The Soviets wanted to have a republic, but the Persian leaders, statesmen and politicians, negotiated the continuation of the Pahlavi dynasty. Later on, they extracted a pledge from the three powers called the Tripartite Pledge, where all of them committed to respect Iran's territorial integrity and leave after the conclusion of the war. In 1946, when the Soviets dragged their feet, the Iranians and the Americans worked together to expel the Soviet Union. It was the only time that Joseph Stalin actually disgorged territory. It was the only time when the Soviet Union actually left a territory that it militarily occupied. And finally, in 1951, Iran nationalizes oil. So if you look at the achievements of that political class, that aristocratic class, preserving the sovereignty of the country, its territorial integrity, and reclaiming its oil. Dr. Mossadegh was a member of that elite. He was one of the more esteemed members of it, and he led the nationalization charge as a parliamentarian, and eventually he was appointed prime minister by the Shah. And that's where things get complicated, and we have the story of the coup. There are two different ways of looking at the coup. One is sort of a mechanics of it, what happened and who did what, and there's a lot of contention and controversy about that. But the more important question is the implications of the coup for Iran's political system. Too often, people tend to draw a straight line between 1953 and 1979, namely suggesting that the coup of 53 made the revolution of 79 inevitable. That sort of a quarter of century is just kind of discarded and washed away from the collective memory. I would argue in the more important question that actually after the coup of 1953, the political system doesn't change that much. The parliament still has its own mind. The prime ministers are still able to independently act. The Shah still has to bargain with other stakeholders, but he is, of course, gradually accumulating more power. And the really hinge years of Iranian politics, in my view, are not 1951, 53, but early 60s, when the system really begins to close down. The old elite is excised, a new elite comes to power, whose basis of power, whose currency of exchange is subservience to the monarchy and technical expertise, as opposed to kind of feel for the country that the land-owning aristocracy had. Now, the mechanics of the coup that tend to occupy people, if not obsess some. There are not one but two coups in August 1953. The first one, I think, took place on August 15th, and that fails. The CIA complicity in that is obvious. When that coup fails, Washington begins to reconsider its option and even calls off any further engagement with the coup plotters, which were Iranian generals and other Iranian politicians, and also members of the clerical elite. The second coup is the more controversial one on August 19th, because everybody has tried to apportion blame about who did what when. I would say it may be impossible with clarity to know what happened in Iran on August 19, 1953, but it has always been my perception that the main drivers of the second coup were the Iranian leaders themselves. And I would actually say one of the things I argue in the book is one of the things I try to do in the book is to restore agency to the Iranians themselves. That they actually were drivers of their own history and their own narrative and their own destiny through much of that period. I think America has exaggerated its role in Iran and has exaggerated its ability to condition outcomes in Iran. So in that sense, you know, what Kermit Roosevelt, the CIA agent, did or didn't do is murky. Too many people make too many conclusive judgments about it. But there were so many actors involved. The situation was so chaotic, it's so difficult, that I think if you think about the coup in the context of Iranian politics at that time, a time when Iranian actors, other than the Shah, were still capable of taking autonomous actions, then I think inevitably one has to credit the Iranians with some degree, if not considerable degree, of agency in execution of the coup. So I tend to, the mechanics of the coup are, as I said, preoccupy people. As I said, it's murky, but I tend to essentially suggest the second one was more of an Iranian initiative. But the implications of the coup, I think, have been exaggerated in the sense that the political system begins to shut down, but it had not completely shut down until you get to early to mid 60s.
And just to give, I suppose, the audience an idea of the context of all of it, you know, perhaps, you know, if we think the French in Indochina, and if they hadn't kind of handled things so poorly and kind of want to keep, you know, their colonial grasp on Vietnam, the United States might not have done some of what it had done there. Is some of that true in Iran? That if it was, you know, initially Truman had fairly good relations and views of Iran, and Eisenhower did as well. I know they all, and succeeding presidents all had their doubts about the Shah. But perhaps is this another instance of where the United States, perhaps in desperation, because it's time of the Korean War, we need the English support. We don't want to upset the English, that maybe we somehow go along with their desires with regards to the nationalization of oil, and, you know, and kind of going along with ideas of replacing the regime in Iran, that maybe was not a good idea.
On the nationalization issue, the United States, well, how did the United States become involved in this particular saga, which is, as you said, it's an Anglo-Iranian dispute. There's a British company, Anglo-Iranian oil company, later on BP, and the Iranian government that nationalizes that company. Why is the United States involved? The United States became involved in that particular dispute at the invitation of Dr. Mossadegh. It was Dr. Mossadegh that wrote a letter to Harry Truman asking him to mediate this dispute. And Harry Truman assigned Avril Harriman to the task, and then succession of other American mediators, most notably George McGee and Dean Acheson and everybody. So the United States gets into this dispute by invitation. The British actually did not want the Americans involved. Throughout this period from 1940s and even before, the Iranians had always tried to invite America to be a participant in their affairs as a means of using the American leverage against their imperial tormentors, Britain and Russia. They were looking for another external actor which was, in their view, unbiased and untainted by colonial legacy. And once the United States gets involved, it becomes very aggressive and very imaginative, actually, in terms of devising a variety of solutions to the oil problem. None of those solutions were acceptable to Dr. Mossadegh, and to be fair to the British, they rejected successive proposals by the United States. By the time Eisenhower is inaugurated in 1953, his first instinct is not to essentially have a coup in Iran, but to resolve the issue along diplomatic lines. But the situation in Iran is deteriorating. Dr. Mossadegh is becoming more despotic in his behavior. There's chaos, the economy is collapsing. And there is a fear, not so much that the Communist Party of today would take over, but as Mossadegh becomes more and more isolated, he will rely on elements of the left, and they will gradually become participants in a coalition government. And if you go back to 1940s and 50s, a lot of communist parties that were coming to power in the Eastern Bloc began their power as partners in a coalition, and they eventually absorbed overthrow the government. So that was the fear. And looking back on it, and even at that time, many suggested that the fear was exaggerated. I should say there were people who opposed the coup. Most notably, the station chief, the CIA station chief in Tehran opposed it. He said, this is not a good idea, for which he was let go. He was reassigned. So there were people who essentially thought that this is not something we should be involved in. The long-term ramifications of this may not be positive, but the story turned out as it turned out. But to some extent, I think, looking back on it, and even at that time, I think it was wrong for the United States to be involved. We can debate how involved the United States was and who was involved and who was primarily responsible for the events in Iran in 1953. But there's no gainsaying that the United States intervened in internal affairs of another country. That's not deniable. We can debate the extent of that intervention and the efficacy of that intervention. But the act itself is a rather undeniable one. And the way it worked out, I think, an unfortunate one.
And just, I suppose, to kind of bring it to the broader region, I think your book, you'd say, and a lot of people would say, that the U.S. definitely had a role, obviously, in the coup. But Mossadegh had a lot of problems that, he might have not have stayed in power 2 or 3 years down the line anyway. But is perhaps maybe the bigger, the deeper concern or problem is the perception of it, that for the Iranian people and then more broadly in the region, it was the idea that the United States, a country that a lot of people were hopeful about, the idea of a non-colonial power like the British or the Russians, that here was this country interfering and overthrowing a legitimate government, a problem government, but one that was legitimate.
Yeah, Eisenhower had a penchant for coups because he wanted to economize on the Cold War. The CIA really comes into its being as a covert institution under Eisenhower. That wasn't the only coup in the Middle East that Eisenhower experimented. Operation Ajax was one. There was a coup in Syria, Operation Straggle, another coup in Egypt, Operation Omega. And all of them actually in some way failed. So Eisenhower had a penchant for using CIA as a means of economizing the Cold War. It was a way of waging the Cold War on the cheap. And then beyond that, in Guatemala and elsewhere, in which you can debate the success or failure of that. And there was yet another coup in Iran in 1958 that nobody talks about. In 1958, there's another sort of attempted coup against the Shah, which had American complicity. So the United States becomes sort of involved in another coup in 1958, this time actually against the Shah as a means of getting him to reformist politics. But the larger question of that, the legacy of the coup that you're suggesting, it's a complicated legacy. It's an ambiguous legacy, and sometimes it's scrubbed of all its ambiguity and presented in stark terms. What would have happened if there had been no coup? I'm not sure if Mossadegh's government was sustainable, but events took place the way they did. And one of the things that's most striking about the coup, looking at it, is the level of clerical complicity in the coup. This is why the Islamic Republic actually talks about the 1953 coup very differently. They talk about the fact, actually it's in the constitution, that all previous efforts against the Shah had failed, other than the 79 revolution, of course. All previous efforts have failed because they did not enjoy divine approbation. That's actually the Islamic Republic constitution. So they essentially suggest that there's a very tense relationship between the Islamic Republic and Dr. Mossadegh and his party, the National Front, because the National Front was not just a political party dedicated to nationalization of oil. It had a very progressive social agenda. Healthcare, education, expansion of franchise, rule of law, and so on. And those aspects of the National Front and that aspect of Mossadegh's legacy is one that is quite disdained by the clerical successors, I would say.
And just to expand it a bit more broadly to regime change in general in the region, obviously Iran, a lot of its neighbors, is a factor one way or the other. With the United States policy. If you look at Afghanistan in the 1980s, obviously are backing the Mujahideen to attempt to overthrow eventually, Soviet-backed government there. Down the line, obviously, that allows the Taliban to come to power and Al-Qaeda to have a safe haven. And we come to the U.S. Invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, which I think almost all experts at the time and everyone in administration and both Democrats and Republicans were in favor, almost everybody, of the war and the invasion. What's your take on, I suppose, not necessarily the overthrow of the Taliban, but perhaps the way we went about it and perhaps, be the short-sightedness of what we not planning very well for the day after, basically the Taliban's out of power, not to mention the fact that once we got distracted by sending, hundreds of thousands of troops to Iraq, it made security more difficult in Afghanistan.
Yeah, these cases are different. The Iranian case is different than the Afghanistan case or the Iraq case because they both involve military intervention. The latter two involved military intervention at a large scale, and the ambitions of the Iraq war were rather extraordinary in the sense that the United States wanted to displace a regime and actually reform a very stubborn political culture. So that was a very ambitious project. In terms of planning the day after, I would say if you look at all of America's wars, and those are wars, they're not the wars that change regimes, but they're wars. The United States planning for aftermath of wars is never really that good. If you look at the first Iraq war, which is largely viewed as a success, the 1991, the planning for aftermath of that war by George H.W. Bush administration, which is viewed as having a superb foreign policy team. Their response to the aftermath of that war was that given Saddam's defeat, he would inevitably be overthrown by his generals. That turned out not to be true. That was a perception, obviously an incorrect one. So it's one of the qualities of the United States, and it's a rather unusual one, is it usually gets the aftermath of the wars wrong. And the World War II is a unique one because the rehabilitation of Germany and Japan has been a case that's, I think, more exceptional than other ones. Korean War ended inconclusively. Vietnam War ended the way it did. Afghanistan and Iraq, as you suggested, have been mired in difficulty. Now, in terms of whether all these pieces necessarily fit in a linear way, the United States supported the various factions of Mujahideen at that time. That led to the rise of Taliban. That led to the rise of Al-Qaeda. And so the line is too linear because at every stage there are decisions made. And at every stage a different decision can be made. It's like 53 leading to 79. There's 25 years of decisions that were made by the Shah and others in Iran, which go a long way toward explaining why 79 revolution happened and why it happened the way it did. So I think one of the things when we draw those lines in a rather linear way is to forget contingency and chance often conditions historical outcome, and more so than I would say a retrospective gaze, which tends to be more definitive when you look back. If I was sitting in the United States somewhere in 1978 and when 79, whatever, with December 79, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and my primary focus was Soviet-American relations, would I think that it would be inappropriate to mire the Soviet Union in a conflict that drains its treasury and in some way maybe contributes to its demise? Probably not. Could I have foreseen that one day in aftermath of collapse of the Soviet Union, Afghanistan would be sanctuary for a lethal terrorist group that would invade American homeland? That would take a remarkable degree of prescience and prognosticating ability that actually I don't have. So I think to look back 20 steps ahead, one of the things I would say about history, if it's understood in its own terms, within the context of its own time, you begin to appreciate the restraints more so than otherwise.
And I suppose just, I guess, again, looking to the region, there are examples of regime change or attempted regime change that the U.S. has been involved in, whether it be, Libya or Egypt with Mubarak, not necessarily forcing him out militarily, but forcing him out through diplomatic means and economic, I suppose, threats of sorts. But I suppose looking at what is a continuing, sadly, disaster in the Middle East, Syria, a lot of people fault Obama for not doing enough. Other people from his administration would say, well, we tried to do what we could, but the United States there was not the political will or public support for a major military intervention. Do you think the U.S. could have done something differently with Assad, or should have done something differently with Assad? Or the fact that he had such strong backers, especially with the Russians and most especially with Iran, who are willing to put much more behind the war, that the U.S. would have been doomed no matter what decision we made?
I tend to look at Syria through the prism of the Lebanese civil war of 70s, and maybe that's the wrong prism to look at it. What happens when a multi-ethnic and multi-confessional state breaks down? Which in case of Lebanon, it has all those ethnic and religious groups, that state breaks down. In case of Syria, again, another multi-ethnic state with a minority ethnicity in control breaks down. And a civil war ensues. How did the Lebanese civil war end? The Lebanese civil war ended when all the parties began to exhaust themselves and Syria intervened, ironically enough, and occupied the country with some 60,000 troops. If you were going to put an end to the Syrian civil war, which at this point has cost 500,000 lives and displaced 12 million people or whatever it is, internally displaced refugees, frankly, the answer to that would have been massive American intervention, a massive commitment to reconstitution of the country and rehabilitation of its infrastructure. Essentially, you would be asking the United States to embark on a fairly ambitious mission, and perhaps with coalition partners, perhaps under the auspices of the international community, but it would take a very considerable commitment. And for the United States to have made that considerable commitment, the American people would have to be buying to it, because it would be a prolonged commitment on a journey whose conclusion is uncertain. Could that case have been made around humanitarian line? That what I would say is that's what would require to prevent the humanitarian catastrophe that is Syria. The Syrian civil war is in some way over. One side won. Assad is in control of 60-70% of the country. There are no more large-scale battles. The country is impoverished and will be impoverished for a very long time. But as I said, the stark answer to that would have been a very fundamental and substantive international intervention with the United States as a coalition partner. Whether that could have been devised, I'm just, that was the case that would have to have been made.
And it's, I suppose, a regime change, but a different format. But looking at Egypt, obviously a major player for the entire region, a very large population, often seen as a model and a focal point for many Arabs in the entire region. Do you think the United States was correct to, I suppose, kind of abandon Mubarak when he kind of got into a certain degree of excesses and the popular will was there to replace him? Even knowing that Morsi was coming along, and then I suppose secondly, the United States not, I suppose, taking role against the removal of Morsi and the restoration of military rule, basically under Sisi. In a lot of ways, a much more repressive regime, maybe that was there 5-10 years ago.
Well, I tend to look at these situations, the Egyptian situation as well, through the prism of the American-Iranian involvement in interaction up to 1978-79 revolution. Namely, when you kind of look at that event, with all the accusations about Jimmy Carter did enough or he didn't do more, he should have done this, the events were driven by the Iranians themselves. I tend to look at Egypt as well as an event driven by Egyptians themselves. As I said, I believe in agency. I believe that the local populations are in command of their history and they make choices and decisions that turn out to be wrong, and too often rather conveniently blame external actors, whether it's the United States, whether it's others. So could the United States had options of preserving the Mubarak regime? I doubt it. Could it have engineered a different aftermath? I tend to be skeptical. I think too often in our conversations about the Middle East, and perhaps elsewhere as well, we tend to exaggerate our ability to condition outcomes. It's one of the unusual things about the Americans, particularly in terms of the encounter in the Middle East, particularly as in Iran, but elsewhere. When things go wrong in the Middle East, the first inclination of Americans is to find other Americans to blame. The peace process is stalled. That's obviously a fault of an American mediator. Maybe it's a fault of Palestinians and Israelis who can't come to terms on an agreement. The Egyptian situation goes from Mubarak to Morsi to a military dictatorship. Is that a fault of the United States? Maybe it's the inability of Egyptians to reconstitute a political system that represents their different constituencies. Could Carter have done more to preserve the Shah? No. So I think a lot of these regional events have to be considered about how the inhabitants of the region and their political leaders behave, because I think most likely they were the drivers of their own history in a lot of those cases. The United States will always have a role. It will always have an impact. It will always have responsibilities. But I think we tend to exaggerate those when it comes to assessing these nations. It's a very unusually and peculiar American thing. And it's very unusual to tell an American audience, sometimes it's not all about you.
I think it's a very good perspective to consider. That I think a lot of Americans, we don't think that you can probably excessively blame either a Republican or Democratic president, but in a lot of ways maybe might not have had that much influence anyway. Please excuse the thunder. But
well,
also, I
just want to give one example, which is just tangentially. When the Shah did not behave as the Carter administration wanted him to, like be forceful and so forth, what Jimmy Carter and his national security advisor, Vic Brzezinski, did, they actually blamed the U.S. ambassador, Bill Sullivan. Well, how about blaming the Shah?
Excellent example. And I suppose also there's another thing. We obviously mentioned within the region, Iran in many ways, both kind of paramilitary level or just direct military action has been along for since 1979, been a major player in combat activities in many parts of the region. We mentioned the Russians, we mentioned others, but I suppose kind of increasingly growing powers and influence in terms of, say, if we look at what happens in Libya, where a lot of times we have Arab countries that might align on different sides of different governments. Does the U.S. we also, I suppose, need to recognize, acknowledge that, say, for the Saudis and the Emiratis, and then the Qataris sometimes have their own perspectives. Obviously, they're in the region. They're much more involved and more concerned, perhaps, about the outcomes. They have big budgets that they're willing to spend, and more recently have powerful militaries they're willing to use as well. I mean, are those kind of newer factors in the last 5 to 10 years that we also maybe aren't, I suppose, accounting for enough?
The United States in the Middle East, has always had problematic allies. The Saudis have always been one of the unusual allies of the United States in the sense that the political systems are very different. One is a sort of conservative religious state, the other one ostensibly a liberal democracy. Their values are different, and often their perspective on the region is different. The Saudis historically have viewed, whether in the 1960s it was Egypt, whether in the 1980s it was Iran, and today it's also Iran. They have to tend to view their nemesis in a very stark terms, and they have always thought the United States should essentially do more than the United States was capable of doing or was willing to do. There's always been tension between the two about how much to do, and the Saudis have at times exaggerated the threats to their security, and the United States has often not lived up to the expectation of what an ally should be. Today, there is an actual real low intensity and high intensity actually conflict between Saudis and Iranians, and it has to do about religion, it has to do with primacy in the region, it has to do about geopolitical competition, it has to do about mastery of the Islamic realm by two countries that predicate their legitimacy on a certain religious reading. This is a competition that's taking place, as you suggested, throughout the Middle East, whether it's in Yemen, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's in Syria, whether it's elsewhere. It's a destructive one. It's destructive for both Saudis and the Iranians, and it's destructive for the region. The question is, the United States has had different approaches toward this particular conflict. At some point, during the Obama years, it tried to mediate that dispute. That didn't go anywhere. During the Trump presidency, it actively chose sides. And today, its policy is a little more ambiguous, to be fair, and it is still developing. But that particular conflict is raging across the Middle East, and increasingly is raging in a bilateral way, in the sense that both countries have accused each other of intervention in their internal affairs. It's one of these disputes that has a real chance of getting out of hand. But I suspect at the end of the day, both parties are likely to pull back. But that's one that bears, I think, watching, because its ramifications are felt throughout the region.
And just to bring it back to Iran, and then I want to open it up to audience questions. Just in broad terms, because obviously it could be an entire semester-long course. Where do you see Iran now? I know in your book you mentioned that in a lot of ways. The great irony is that the current Islamic regime has a lot of the same issues that the Shah has himself, with economic I suppose difficulties and fragmentation within the classes, dissatisfaction among the people. Where do you see the regime now, and I suppose the Iranian population at different points over the last many years? There have been large-scale revolts. Sadly, they haven't been able to lead to something more substantial, and a lot of people, rightly or wrongly, say the United States did not support those strongly enough. What's your assessment of Iran right now?
Today, 42 years, I think, after the revolution's success, I think today is the day revolution succeeded, February 11th, 1979. So it is 42 years. The Islamic Republic is an exhausted ideological state. It is making a lot of mistakes that the Shah made in three respects. Number one, like the Shah's regime of the late 70s, it is a regime incapable of reforming itself, even amid its senses of urgency to reform. Number two, its economic problems are similar to the Shah's Iran in one respect, that not so much in terms of unfulfilled expectations, because everybody's expectations are to some degree unfulfilled, but in terms of the corrosive perception that economic good times are over and the only people who benefited were those who were tied to the regime. That was a perception in Iran in the late 70s, it's a perception today. Number three, both the Shah and his clerical successor pursued foreign policies whose costs were more obvious than benefits. In Shah, in terms of, it was a very reckless military buildup that drained the treasury. In Islamic Republic's case, it's being involved in other people's civil wars, whose benefits are not entirely obvious. At least are not obvious to me what Iran obtained from its large-scale investment in Syria. Now, history doesn't repeat itself, and I don't even believe it necessarily rhymes. The Islamic Republic's leaders are uniquely incapable of learning from their own revolution, because they have mythologized the revolution so much that it's no longer a historical event. It's something unapproachable. And therefore, they cannot essentially learn the lessons of their own revolution, even when they were participants in it in some respects. If you look at the history of Iran in 20th century and into 21st century, and if you're looking at the theme of that history, it is a history of a population seeking self-determination and a series of central governments resisting that plea. The one time when the public succeeded in overcoming the regime was 1979, and the consequences were dire. That struggle for emancipation goes on, and it's going on today. Whether it will succeed, how it will succeed, I think it remains to be seen. But I believe that central tension in Iran's history of past 100 years, a population struggling for freedom, unsatisfied with transactional bargains and wanting a role in their government, and central authorities refusing to listen to that, whether monarchs or clerics, that struggle goes on. And should it succeed one day, it'll confound another generation of Americans who told themselves, as they did in 1979, that despite all those problems, the Shah's regime was indeed durable.
And I suppose, just how would you, categorize the opposition? Obviously, there's not a formulated, obvious opposition party or a strong, opposition I suppose, contingent, that we do have people, relative moderates, but they're moderates out of a Islamic regime. So that's all relative, it's like Rouhani or Khatami before that. What is the state of the kind of less conservative and I suppose more kind of open political forces in Iran? And do you think there's any chance of them gaining an ascendancy or that this regime would have to fall before Iran could become a more traditional kind of liberal democracy?
Well, I don't believe, as I said, the regime can reform itself. The promise of reform was in the 1990s with the Khatami experiment, as you suggested. The Khatami experience was somehow the Islamic Republic could harmonize its religious convictions with its pluralistic pretensions, using its own constitutional processes, elections, parliaments, plebiscites, legislation, and so forth. That argument is largely, if not categorically, evaporated. It's a narrower-based regime, largely manned by conservative forces who still have some fidelity to the founding ideology of the state. So I guess my answer would be to that question in a very simple terms. I don't believe the Islamic Republic can evolve. I think it may collapse, but I don't think evolve. And how it collapses is impossible to see. Such events, revolutionary events, I guess we're talking about in this case, are rare and they're impossible to prognosticate ahead of time. It's hard to understand it when you're living through it, and it's difficult to retrospectively document. But the answer to your question is no, I don't think the Islamic Republic can evolve. Whether it collapses, how it collapses, those are similarly impossible questions to answer with precision. I would say one thing. In November 1978, shortly before the success of the Iranian Revolution in February 79, 3 months later, Ayatollah Khomeini was asked that precise question in Paris in exile by, I believe, a reporter from the Guardian newspaper. It asked him, how does this collapse, that monarchy? He said, I don't know how it happens. I don't know when it happens, but all the signs are telling me it's going to happen.
And I suppose in terms of the U.S. perspective on that, if beyond, we've done it in varying degrees, massive economic sanctions and economic tools to be used against Iran, do you think the United States should pursue anything beyond that to encourage the downfall of the regime?
Well,
or again, you don't know what you might get afterwards?
Well, I'm not sure what beyond that is. As I said, I think the future of Iran will be largely determined by the Iranians themselves. The United States will have a role, and as you suggest, its economic policies have depleted the Islamic Republic's treasury, and it has made it difficult to sustain its constituency because Islamic Republic today is not so much a state that ideologically persuades people, but it's a massive welfare state. And when it's incapable of generating subsidies, it faces problems from the working classes that it views as its primary and today exclusive constituency. So it could make life harder for the regime. But, last 4 years of extraordinary pressure on Iran, economic pressure, a pandemic that they have mismanaged, does suggest some measure of resiliency in the regime as well. What else can the United States do? I think there's always more you can do if that's your objective, but one should always approach these issues with some measure of modesty and humility.
All right, just turn to the audience. Solomon asks, the Shah was going to be overthrown. Was there an opportunity to prevent the Ayatollah from returning, and the Carter administration refused to state whether they would support or oppose this action, which shaped the course of the revolution? Do you agree with this hypothesis?
That issue comes up a lot. It comes up a great deal about could Jimmy Carter have done more. The Carter archives on the revolution have not yet been released. They're tied up in lawsuits and so forth, but they're beginning to be released. And based upon what we know, based upon, I think, what we will know more, it is my judgment that no American, and I said this earlier today, no American tried harder to prevent the success of the revolution in Jimmy Carter. He tried to, once he focused on the situation, the revolution was a rapid fire, he tried to raise Shah's morale. He advised him to restore order. He sent General Heiser in January to get the Iranian military in some kind of a shape for a takeover, which was impossible to do. And in the aftermath of the revolution, he is, as far as I know, the only president to formally commit the United States to a policy of regime change in Iran. By formally, I mean he is the only president that I know who on December 1979 issued a presidential finding ordering the CIA to overthrow the Iranian regime. What else can he do? This question comes up all the time. Did Jimmy Carter lose Iran? No, Khomeini won Iran. I believe, as I said, in agency. I believe the Shah was incapable of acting. To be fair to the Shah, and I think it's important to be fair, he was a lot of things. The Shah was cynical. He was certainly arrogant, but he wasn't cruel. And nor were his generals at the end. There weren't bloodthirsty people who were willing to do what Assad has done to stay in power. They weren't willing to do that. And nothing Jimmy Carter could have said would make them do that. So, you know, the regime so much, you know, you can argue whether the revolution succeeded or the regime collapsed, but probably the latter preceded the former.
Okay. Another question from the audience. Phoebe asks, do you have any knowledge of current track 2 diplomacy with Iran? And if efforts are ongoing, would you expect between the Biden administration that's newly come into office?
I suspect both parties to the Iran nuclear deal, the United States and Iran, both parties are not in compliance with the agreement. I suspect they will both return to the agreement in some choreographed manner. And I suspect at some point they will try to renegotiate the deficiencies of the agreement. I think there is now a consensus in both capitals. In Washington, there's a consensus that the nuclear deal was deficient and needs to be renegotiated. In Iran, there is a consensus that none of that is going to happen. So I think you return to the deal, and then the negotiations for readjusting the deal will be stalemated.
Just touching upon that, I suppose a lot of people, after the Trump administration unilaterally withdrew from the deal, a lot of people said it took years of pressure from Bush and then pressure from Obama to get everyone on board, the Europeans in particular, and also to get the Russians and the Chinese to acquiesce. Do you think that's going to be very hard now going forward, especially getting the Russians to kind of at least acquiesce to a new deal when I suppose they feel like they were taken advantage of in Libya by signing off on UN agreements there? What's your thought on actually getting a new deal, and can you get everybody else back in agreement?
Well, I think everybody else can get back to the existing agreement. I don't think there will be a new deal, and it's not so much whether the Russians want a new deal, because the Iranians don't want a new deal. And to be fair to the Iranians, the Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, was not an interim agreement. There was nothing in it that said that this deal could be renegotiated. It wasn't the beginning of a process. It was the end of itself. So when the Iranians look at the deal, they said, why do we have to renegotiate this? So if John Kerry negotiated a deficient deal, this is not youth soccer league. You don't get a do-over. So from their perspective, everybody adheres to the agreement, which was the final agreement. There is not a single sentence in the 159 pages or whatever it is of the Iran nuclear deal that said, later on we'll renegotiate aspects of this. That's not there. And so they're under no obligation to renegotiate it. They say they're not going to renegotiate it. it is not a factional dispute, hardliners, moderates, and this. Everybody sort of agrees on that. So I don't foresee a way that the agreement could be renegotiated or extended or modified. Now, that may be the poverty of my imagination, but at this point, I don't anticipate that.
Another good question from the audience. David asks, what do the majority of citizens in Iran want from the regime?
I think what they want from the regime is what they have always wanted from the regime. Some measure political representation, meaningful political participation in national affairs, an economic system that works for everybody, end to corruption, and to some extent rescinding this imperial venture that the Islamic Republic has embarked on. The Islamic Republic's policies in Syria, Palestine, and toward Israel and others are extraordinarily costly as they are self-defeating. And they don't actually enjoy popularity at home. So I would say what they want from the clerical rulers is precisely the thing they wanted from the Shah: representation, accountability, and responsible international statecraft.
And I guess turning back to if the Iran nuclear deal can be resumed, or some version of it anyway, a lot of our Arab allies, in particular the Saudis and the Emiratis again, were very unhappy that that deal was reached. Do you think that is because, in essence, they just, I suppose, do not trust the Iranians and are worried about the U.S. developing closer ties with Iran, or that there's more concerns beyond that? I mean, what would it take, I suppose, to kind of bring a degree of stability to the region, even if it's not great relations, but some degree of stability between the major powers in the region?
Well, I think that the different actors with different perceptions. For the Israelis, I think their principal concern is not intimacy in U.S.-Iran relations. I don't think they anticipate that. But their principal concern is that the deal did not obstruct Iran's path to nuclear weaponry. Right? So their concern is a technical one. For the Saudis, it's not so much the technical aspects of the deal, but the fact that any agreement could enrich Iran and therefore empower it in the region. I think by now Israelis are confident or able to handle the Iranians in the region. So for different parties, it is a different concern. And they sort of all come together and their interests do overlap. But at a very basic level, for the Israelis, I think the concern is that they want an agreement that is a meaningful barrier to Iran's nuclear aspirations, not an interim one. And for the Saudis, they worry about empowerment of Iran that comes through an agreement that reintegrates it back to the international economy and the global economy, and therefore it becomes a more menacing presence in the region.
And lastly, just a new administration coming in, new, but obviously very experienced. A lot of the foreign policy hands are some of the same people from the Obama administration. What do you expect from Biden with regards to not just Iran, but I suppose maybe some of the other major issues in the Middle East?
Well, I suspect that Middle East will not be a priority, not just for any administration that wants to come to power at this time, because of the domestic concerns that are pressing. A pandemic, vaccination of the country, dealing with economic consequences of that pandemic. Those are the major issues that will preoccupy any presidency at this point, or should. In terms of international concerns, there is the usual, or even more than usual, concern about a rising China and the impact of that on the critical region of Asia. I suspect that'll be a priority. I think the Middle East will recede from a priority because its conflicts are intractable, solutions not entirely obvious. So it is a place where interim arrangements can get you from one week to the other one while you focus on larger issues. But as you suggest, it is an experienced team. From all accounts, it's a very capable team. And the challenges they confront are quite extraordinary. But I do think the primary focus of any administration at this point has to be the domestic rehabilitation of the United States after a pandemic that has so far cost 450,000 lives and in an extraordinary degree of economic cost. It'll take years for the United States to be able to bring back the small businesses and so on. So to the extent that the United States is a country of large ambitions, and it had a very large ambition in the Middle East in the aftermath of 9/11, namely to reformulate the political culture of the region. To the extent it has large ambitions, it's likely to be in terms of its domestic issue. And this is not even to talk about issues of racial equality and economic disparity and so forth that also haunt the United States as it moves forward in the 21st century.
Well, again, that was an excellent discussion. I want to say thank you again so much, Ray, for joining us, especially on short notice. And again, we have the link on our comment section on our website, but I definitely highly recommend Ray's most recent book, The Last Shah, if you really want an excellent depth of understanding of Iran, and I suppose, not just where it is today, but really how it got there, basically from, World War II through, the revolution. And Ray, I want to thank you so much, and we're wonderful to have you, and hopefully we'll have you again at some point in Houston in person. And to all of our audience, thank you, and take care, everybody, and we'll see you again next week. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, thank you.